Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me. I just want to, in case we have some latecomers who come in, I'm wondering if people could sort of move toward the center of the theater, take in any empty seats in the middle, and so that if people come in late, they can sit on the sides. We would appreciate it. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. Welcome to the National Archives and our latest program supporting the launch of the Archive's new exhibit, Spirited Republic. Spirited Republic is an exhibition that takes nearly 100 National Archives records, draws them together to look at the production, consumption, and regulation of alcohol throughout U.S. history. The story is at times whimsical, sometimes serious, as all good stories should be. If you haven't already seen it, I welcome you to come back to the O'Brien Gallery and take a look at this truly terrific exhibition. The National Archives Foundation is the principal partner to the National Archives for all things fun. The Spirited Republic definitely fills that bill. The foundation provides funding for exhibitions, education, outreach, online resources, family days, sleepovers in the rotunda, as well as capital support. We support the archives with its mission to make the records more accessible to the public, which is very different than Congress. They have a less fun job to fund. So we raise private support through corporations, foundations, and individuals like you. I know we have a number of foundation members in the audience. Thank you. For those who are not, you're passionate about history and civic literacy, we welcome you. And obviously, if you're here tonight, you know a thing about food and drink. So we welcome you to visit archivesfoundation.org, where you can learn more about the foundation and membership. And we're actually hosting, in addition to all the things that happen here in the theater, the foundation during Spirited Republic will be hosting a number of programs as well, and you'll find out information about that on our website. And don't forget, anytime you're here or near a computer, you can visit the Archives store, which also supports the National Archives, myarchivestore.org. It'll be a historic shopping experience for you. With those commercials completed, I give you our partner, the official Archives welcome, and he will bring on our panel the 10th Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero.
Good evening and welcome to my house. It's nice to have you here tonight. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube station. What Patrick didn't say is a little secret that I tell audiences about application to the foundation. If you apply for membership in the foundation, no one has ever been turned down for membership. A few years ago, our exhibit, What's Cooking Uncle Sam, showcased food in America. A few days ago, as you heard, we opened a new exhibit called Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History. Tonight we'll talk about both food and drink, led by experts in both fields. Libby O'Connell, author of The American Plate, A Culinary History in 100 Bites. Corby Kummer, senior editor of The Atlantic, and Jim Hewes, chief mixologist and cocktail historian at the Willard Hotel. But before we get started, I'd like to let you know about two other programs coming up later this month here in the William G. McGowan Theater. On Tuesday, March 24th at 7 p.m., we'll be showing The Stone River as part of the 2015 Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital and in partnership with the National Gallery of Art. This 2013 documentary traces the destiny of European stoneworkers who settled in Vermont at the beginning of the 20th century. 2 days later, on Thursday, March 26th at 7:30 p.m., we'll host the 8th Annual Forum on Women in Leadership. The theme this year is Then and Now, Women in Civil Rights Leadership. And a distinguished panel will discuss their experiences in the civil rights movement. Moderated by MSNBC's Melissa V. Harris-Perry, panelists will include Joyce Ladner, Janai Nelson, Avis Jones-DeWeaver, and Charlene Carruthers. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive them in the regular mail or by email. Food and drink are essential for life. Once basic needs are met, however, humans tend to stretch the boundaries of necessity to seek out what is possible. Millennia of culinary exploration and experimentation have resulted in a world of flavors and textures that appeal to all our senses. In the United States, what we put on our plates and in our glasses has grown out of the many cultures that put down roots here. Immigration from abroad and mobility within have changed what we eat and drink. Tonight, our experts will talk about our diverse cuisine and the liquid libations that we have enjoyed throughout our history. The opening line of the Spirited Republic exhibit states, since the first European settlers arrived, Americans have enjoyed a drink. The exhibit progresses from early America, when a healthful dram was part of everyday life, to the temperance movement, to the end of the great experiment, Prohibition. It's a wonderful exhibit, and if you haven't already had a chance, I hope you'll come back and see it upstairs in the Lawrence O'Brien Gallery. It took the work of a number of people to make Spirited Republic happen, and one of those was Libby O'Connell, Chief Historian and Senior Vice President for the History Channel and A&E networks. Libby not only was instrumental in history becoming the first major sponsor of Spirited Republic, but also provided editing and production support for all the videos you see in the exhibit. She was an enthusiastic supporter of the exhibit concept from the minute she heard of it. And directly after tonight's program, she'll be in the theater lobby to sign copies of The American Plate. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Libby O'Connell, Corby Kummer, and Jim Hewes.
Good evening. Thank you for that great introduction, and I'm delighted to see all of you here. Please sit down. When we think about the history of this country, I don't think we realize that drink was much more than just a way to while the time or enjoy ourselves at the Willard Hotel under Jim Hewes' very capable hands, which we'll want to be hearing much more about. But in fact, alcohol and the production of it plays a fundamental role in the economy and history of nations, especially our own. And I think that history, in sort of everybody's idea of enjoyment and frivolity, is lost. And so I'm going to ask Libby to bring us back to the origins of alcoholic drinks, and not just the economy, but as a source of nutrition, as a source of safe water, and as a source of the economy. So you brought several images. I'm just going to ask for one right now. We should always remember the image of that book, because you will soon have it in your house and in your bookshelves. So it should be emblazoned in your consciousness.
I'm going to hire him.
You should own this book, and if you're very good and polite, you can have a signed copy after this talk. But I think that you brought some apples.
I did.
Which we think of as, enjoyment for eating. Certainly our forebears did not. So why don't you tell us about what apples and pears were grown for here?
Okay. The early British English settlers, they were English at the time, up and down the eastern seaboard, came from a tavern culture. The Spanish had arrived over 100 years before the British settled the eastern seaboard, and they were more of a wine culture, and you'll see that the vineyards followed the missionaries as they went up through Mexico and up into California, where actually vineyards thrived and still do. But along the eastern seaboard, you had the English settlers who came from a tavern culture, and beer was part of everyday life, young, old, and in between. However, they arrive on, let's look at the settlers we know as the Pilgrims. 1620, they land on Cape Cod, and they write home, "No beer." They were so upset because, of course, they wanted to be drinking beer, much more healthful than mere water. Water in Europe was not to be trusted. They didn't know how to make it more healthy, but they knew that it did cause some diseases. Beer, on the other hand, could be relied on to not make you sick unless you drank too much of it. And so they were devoted to their daily beers.
Which was a whole different thing. If you were ill from water that wasn't fermented and had the preservative of alcohol in it, you could get a host of waterborne illnesses
That could kill you very quickly.
that affect
Cholera,
us all
cholera.
when we travel now.
Beer, cholera.
But beer safeguarded against that.
That's right. But beer was harder to make. It created its own complications. And one alternative, which was very popular back in the old country and was quickly adapted to here, was hard cider. And what you'll see in this slide are apples and pears. If you wanted something new, you would have Perry. I mean, change of pace. Perry was a hard pear juice. And those, Sam Adams, Sam Adams was a brewer, but John Adams, who we consider rightfully so a sober-sided man, a lawyer, never one for frivolity, disdained Christmas because it was too much fun, started every day with a large mug of hard cider.
As they say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. It also keeps a lot of other things away, including different diseases. And people evolved with their drinking habits with ciders in terms of you drop an egg into the cider. Or perhaps you took that barrel of cider and put it someplace and let it sit for a long time and then brought it out and used some of the technologies that were coming over here in terms of distilling, and you could do a lot of different things with apples. Apples were kind of a staple for people in terms of, apple pie, apple pie and ice cream. There you go, welcome to America. But apples were, I grew up in upstate New York and in the fruit district, and seasonally, people were, you start with strawberries, and you go to apricots, and you go to cherries, and you go into pears, and then you go into the apples, and people lived around, your granges lived around the production of apples and what came off of it, and people realized that if you take 100 pounds of apples and try to get them to market, what happens? They go bad. But if you make cider,
and so most of the apples that were grown, I think until about 1850, were not apples for eating out of hand, except for a couple of the breeds like Pippins.
We call them canning apples. It's like canning cherries. They're specifically.
Right, what I was about to say, I thought it was more like 1870, but you know better than I.
No, I'll go with that date.
No, we're all going to go home and look this up along with so many other things. But the idea of cultivating dessert apples, as they were called, is much more recent than we understand. And Johnny Appleseed and the widespread cultivation of apples were exclusively for cider.
They were
That's
cider
what
apples.
it was.
Yeah.
It was to make an alcoholic beverage. It wasn't to eat them and be an innocent after-school snack. It was entirely to be alcoholic. So there are two books that I'm sure Libby knows of, if it has not read. One was written by Ben Watson in Vermont, and it was a history of heirloom apples in this country. That's about 6 years ago by Chelsea Green Press. And then there's one just this year by one of the best food writers in the country, Rowan Jacobson, and that is about apples in America. And again, what it is, it's the history of the distilling and fermenting industry, dessert apples. And I wonder, Jim, have you seen the revival of hard ciders, which we in New England, I live mostly in Boston, have seen a great deal of?
Well, you find that the majority of new items that are coming into the marketplace, it's primarily industry driven. And you look at like wine coolers 30 years ago. Cider is different because people got involved with home brewing. Now you've got the change in liquor law, so people are actually able to distill spirits. And one of the offshoots is this, going back and looking at the old recipes and making hard ciders. And all of the major companies have gotten involved in it, whether it's Angry Orchard, or I'm not promoting anybody specifically, but the ciders are out there.
But hard cider is not distilled, is it?
No, it's not. It's a fermentation process. It's a natural fermentation process, and an offshoot of technology. A point that I should bring up also is as Johnny Appleseed is going across the country, throwing these seeds, growing apple trees. Well, there's a reason for that. Because when you look at when the apple trees pollinate in the early spring, that helps to attract what? Bees, and they help cross-pollinate. So you would plant fruit trees, okay, to help to pollinate your wheat or your corn or your rye or whatever you were planning on growing. The wine region out in California had an interesting situation. When they were developing the wine region over 100 years ago in Napa and Sonoma, the immigrants came in, and what did they do? They planted fruit trees, and then they planted their vineyards. Well, land is valuable. You got a $200 Cabernet, and you want to increase production. They started pulling out the fruit trees, the plum trees, the apricot trees. They started pulling those out, and it affected the bloom on their grapes because they didn't have the cross-pollination because it was all. And that's one of the things about apples and peaches and pears and the other fruits is that they played an integral role. And also, it's a heck of an electioneering potion when you look at it historically. Traditionally, in fact, William Henry Harrison was the first president to really, as they said, keep the barrel rolling. They would roll a cider barrel into town.
Well, he ran on hard cider.
He ran on hard cider,
right?
And he had a glass of cider every morning with an egg in it.
And cider always meant hard fermented cider. It's only, I don't know when, even in this century, that cider didn't mean hard cider, that it meant sweet cider.
I wonder if that didn't start during Prohibition, but I don't know the answer to that.
It could well do, because even the cider, but I have to say, I grew up near cider mills. In fact, 2 roads in Ellington, Connecticut, where I'm from, were named for cider mills, including Sads Mill Road. And by the time we went there, it was always lightly fermented. It just happens because there's so much natural yeast within the apples as they're being pressed. When you were beginning bartending, was it something that was ever sold as a drink, or was it considered
Cider as a drink?
right,
cider?
hard cider, or was it too rustic
You
and
didn't
weird?
see it. You know, you had apple juice and then you had cider. And ciders, while growing up in upstate New York, were traditionally available. There was a window, and that window was September, October, and into November. You know, you go to a football game and everybody's drinking cold cider and grill cakes or donuts, you know,
Right.
with the sugar on them. You know, that was like
Grill cakes, that's some euphemism for deep fried donuts. Grill cakes.
anyway, grill cakes. Yeah, you just toss them in the oil and.
But you didn't have, but now there are commercially, the way you order artisan beer and small beers, there's now ciders.
Yeah.
That's as of when? Can you date it?
You didn't see it. If you walked into an establishment 40 years ago in Rochester, New York, and said, you know, can I have a gin and apple juice, and it'd go like table 86 is over there, and the back door is right behind it. You know, and out the door you go. People in you know, children drank apple juice. It was good for you.
But you're asking about when
Hard cider.
In England, it's always been available.
Right, and somebody I wrote about in my book on slow food named Stephen Wood from Poverty Lane Orchards in New Hampshire was one of the first New England growers to try to revive dessert apples. And what he did was he studied the history of cider fermentation, and he started fermenting it on its own. Mm-hmm. And then in Western Massachusetts, this revival began already in the 90s. And now it's available commercially in bottles that look like beer bottles. But it seems to me fairly recent. Do you all go into a bar and order cider, hard cider?
It's good.
How many do? So
That's
yeah,
why
you're
you're here.
primed, all of you guys. But it does seem to be pretty recent to me. I mean, if you go to Birch and Barley, for example,
It's literally within the last decade that a market has been created, and part of that is because of the change in the liquor laws on the federal and state levels, so that you and I now can go out and make more than 2.2 gallons of it. You can make a lot of it, and then market it. And this is what happened with the revival in the beer industry 30 years ago, is that the regional markets take off, and you get a local, you know, a regional clientele, and then it expands. So you're in Boston and you're having a local cider, and you go, well, why don't we have that in Washington, D.C.? And that's how the expansion takes
They're
place.
wonderful hard ciders up the Hudson, where you were talking about.
That's right, up by Peekskill and up above
Libby,
Peekskill.
when you mention in your book the enormous wave of German immigrants, the largest country's ethnic group in the 19th century, as immigrants, and how they bring over beer and pretzels. But when did beer start to supplant cider as the main drink of the working class, or period, the main drink?
Before the Civil War, and then it really comes into its own after the Civil War. You start having beer halls, and this is interesting, I think, because up in the 19th century you saw saloons, but women did not go to saloons. Most women did not go to
Nor to
saloons.
restaurants.
Nor to restaurants.
Most ladies didn't go to
Right.
it.
And
The ladies
that's
didn't
absolutely
go.
right. But beer halls, women could come, like in Germany, where you know families were welcome, and women and children could come, and they would enjoy beer at lunch, and it was not considered inappropriate at all. So there's a real revival, and sort of seen as being these were family-friendly places to come and enjoy a meal, and that is different from going into a saloon where there was food served often. Always, I think, in New York State.
No such thing as a free lunch.
Well, as they say,
It
yeah,
comes
there's
from
no
just
such
that.
thing as a
Yeah.
free lunch. If you were paying for your booze, you could have all the food
Yeah.
you wanted.
Yeah.
As long as you were paying for your no freeloading, you know, no
Yeah, you
hanging
couldn't just
out.
take the food. But in the German ability to make beer, and really by the end of the century they were mass producing it, right, distributing it on a national basis. that really made beer the drink of the working class in America.
But it was part of working men's wages, beer, wasn't it?
The
Yes.
pail of beer.
It was, and which meant that it was something that was drunk during business hours.
Yes, and you know, really
A la
up until
John Adams with his
recently,
cider.
yeah, it was served in boys' boarding schools to the teachers at lunchtime. I love that. My husband taught art class at one year before he went to law school, and he did not know he'd be served beer at lunch. He said, "This is the greatest job I've ever had."
I'm now thinking back to my afternoon high school biology class. This might explain why Mr. Haller threw erasers at me in math class.
That might
after
be it.
lunch.
That might be it.
This is new, but beer was the cheap drink. It was what fueled the working class.
It has calories and carbohydrates. These are good things if you're working hard.
It's good food. People
Yeah,
say
it's
beer, it's a food group
Liquid
in
bread.
itself.
Yeah, that's what it's always been called. But what about agriculture? Did you look in your book, or did you ever encounter how it changed agriculture? For example, in upstate New York, there was a hops industry. If you go to the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, they have a whole hops exhibit, and they have a whole hops program because it was big in upstate New York. Do you know where barley and where these developments came about?
I don't know where they're grown now. I mean, I know that it was grown locally up really from Virginia on north. People were growing hops, they were growing barley. I mean, barley was an easier crop to grow, actually, less fussy crop than wheat.
It also it's much more cold tolerant.
And there was also kind of a cultural change also in terms of the type of beer you were drinking. Rather than drinking a porter or a stout or a heavy English
Yes.
beer, bottom fermented, they got into
tops and
this is what the Germans brought over. They brought over, a different style of beer, the lagers that were lighter, easier to drink, easier on the palate, and also easier to
Mass
serve.
They were more predictable. They were more predictable.
And so they
that's
could be
the key.
mass-produced,
Yes.
no? Because that's what the German factories and Anheuser-Busch and what we think of as St. Louis and
Yeah.
the growth is of very controllable beers. Let's go back, though, to rum, because that's an integral part of this country's history, and sugar. And you deal with that in the book, and it's in the exhibition.
Yeah. In fact, I have some pictures.
I thought you had a sugarcane picture, not
Let's see
that
if
I
I can
wanted to
get this
anticipate
going.
you.
Oh, that's a Syllabub glass.
No, we're
keep
gonna wait on
going.
the Syllabub.
There we go. Okay, so this is an image showing the cultivation of sugarcane in the West Indies. Sugarcane is not indigenous to the West Indies. It was brought over through Egypt, although it had started in Southeast Asia thousands of years ago, traveled across there through Europe where it didn't grow, and then they brought it to the West Indies where it thrived. But it had a huge labor demand. It created a huge labor demand, and these plantations made a few British and other Europe, mostly French families, enormously rich. These were very, very profitable plantations. Their land was so valuable that they imported food for their enslaved labor force rather than grow enough food on these islands. I think that's an amazing
Because they didn't
idea.
want to waste the
They
land on
didn't want-
anything but sugarcane?
Exactly. So they were importing barrels of salted fish from the Potomac.
Yeah, I was about to say, I doubt it was lovely fresh produce.
No, it was gross. I mean, it must have been just vile. So anyway, this is a story of how slavery and sugar are intrinsically tied, and they thrived in the New World in a way that had never been seen before. Most slaves that were brought over across the Atlantic went to Brazil. The second largest group stayed in the West Indies, and a smaller proportion, the smallest group, came to the British colonies in what's now the continental United States. But rum is intrinsically tied to this because it's molasses that forms the basis of rum. And a lot of the rum was made in New England. In fact, so much it was made in Medford. I went to Tufts University.
Mm-hmm.
I know Medford, and that's where rum was from.
Yeah,
Anyway.
the jumbos. Yeah.
It's still the most popular, I think it's the most popular liquor in Boston still. But it is popular along, not maybe with your friends, But with my friends, now on the coastal, in port towns, it retained its popularity for a long time, and it was the most popular alcoholic beverage, just, liquor in the colonies.
Remind us what the triangle trade was.
Oh, well, the triangle trade is theoretically between England, the colonies, Africa, and back. And that would be shipping, but it could also have included the West Indies. And we know that actually a lot of the trade was north-south along the coast. But the triangle trade is when you're bringing slaves from Africa to the West Indies, the molasses from the sugarcane is shipped up north, turned into rum.
Where the slaves were.
Well, the slaves were mostly in the West Indies, and then along
No, but I mean
the south.
in the boats.
Yes.
They take up that space on the weight.
Yes.
So they're the ballast going
Yes.
north.
And with the molasses. And then the molasses is turned into rum. The rum is consumed. But there are other things being shipped over to Great Britain, to the New World.
Yeah, to
the Old
England.
World.
Including rum.
And then it works in
And
reverse
tobacco.
in that.
And so you have the tobacco triangle as well.
And then the early industrial commercialization in England, they're selling consumer goods to New England and the colonies to, where are you going to spend your money when that's where the trade was, whether it was the porcelains, the glassware, the metallurgy, that was the other side of the
manufactured
triangle.
items.
So what went over came back in terms of the mercantile exchange.
So like that Syllabub glass that you saw, that would have been made in England. And you'd see these, and you can see them. It's actually really fun. I really recommend reading old newspapers. And especially if you they're all on, a lot, not they're all, but many are online. And you can see announcements about what the ships are bringing in for people to buy. And you'll notice they advertise, bringing Syllabub glasses along with the fine soaps and other items that weren't available to purchase in the colonies. And of course, around the time of just before the Revolution, there was a change in how much items people were willing to buy, because they had a little bit more money, so they wanted to sort of keep up with the Joneses on the other side of the Atlantic. So they bought tea sets, right? Because they wanted to drink tea and be like the British, and they bought drinking glasses. So when they were drinking their whatever they preferred, they had nice glassware. Of course, this was not for the average laborer who was making shoes or out in the fields, but for a growing middle class, they wanted to have these items.
Does Syllabub not have rum in it?
No, it has wine in it.
Oh, it has wine in it, because I'm about to ask you about wine in England. But again, tell us what Syllabub is, because first of all, as Libby points out, it has the most wonderful name, whether you know what it is or not.
You know it's something fun, right? Syllabub.
Yeah. What's a syllabus?
You
What's
go-
a syllable?
you wanna go for
What's
that
a
one?
syllable?
'Cause you know.
Oh,
Well, no, up in, it's
Syllabus.
interesting because it's what came first, the name or the drink. But when you think about the drink in terms of how it separates out, and basically a syllabub is taking a dairy product and fortifying it with a fermented spirit. But there's a process, and the thing that is the binding agent in the whole thing is the citrus, the lemon or the lime, and the sugar. And it's fascinating when you think about where did the Syllabub end up. Well, you look at 200 years of cocktails. You have a Ramus gin fizz. You have milk creams or egg creams,
Right.
similar thing. But that interaction, technology's changed, so things wouldn't separate out. With a Syllabub, though, the beauty of it is that it separates out.
You make it and you stir it all together. And actually, they had.
So tell us about the it, because it's got whipped cream in it,
Whipped
so you'll
cream.
be really interested right away.
Right, whipped cream, heavy cream, and a little bit of sugar. And you can make it with red wine, although I would recommend using white wine.
Because it's prettier? Why?
I just think the red wine with the whipped cream is kind of gross.
Well, there you
Doesn't-
are.
Well, what's interesting about
That's an
it,
historical fact.
well, the white wine, it actually, and you know that you made it right when it separates out
Separates.
almost immediately, and there's clarity. You have this beautiful, frothy, citrusy whipped cream kind of Cool Whip thing on top, and
Don't say
you've got
Cool
this
Whip.
wine, and anyway. But straw or spoon, you know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yeah. And you know what? It actually, I'm glad you brought that up. The clarity of the glass is an interesting phenomenon because when this first became popular, and actually, you know how we have food trends today? Like
Oh,
remember
no,
that
we have
moment
no
was like,
trends. We're
was like,
trend-proof in this country.
sushi is everywhere, right? How did that happen? Well, it's true, right? And now you don't even notice it anymore. But there was a moment when you really noticed it. Now you notice other things. But Syllabub had one of the longest lasting food trends of any food that really came in and was really popular. They came in the 17th century, in the 1600s.
Yeah.
So it's very early. It becomes really popular in the 18th century, and it's still made into in the 1820s, the Monroe family is still drinking it, James Monroe.
Do you suppose that part of the popularity was dairy was cheap because you had a cow? So that was very available, and it would lengthen the wine, which was really
Yeah.
expensive.
But there are recipes about that you can take the wine, and you probably know this, you mix it with the sugar and the lemon juice, and then you take your glass to the dairy. And you milk the cow right into the glass, and you have a cow outside. What are you going to do? I mean, if you want fresh milk, you have to be near a dairy because it's not going to keep, right? They don't have refrigeration. So you milk a cow. Notice I'm doing this correctly. Any of you who know how to milk a cow? It's not like that, right? It's not pull down, it's push up and squeeze. So you're doing this. It's true. It's true.
I grew up in dairy farms.
So you know it's true,
Yes,
right?
yes, I know it's
So so as the milk squirts into the glass, it creates froth. And I'm serious. Go online. You can see these directions. Take your glasses to the dairy, or have the maid do it. My maid does that for me almost.
The milkmaid.
Yes,
The milkmaid.
who had the lovely complexion.
So wine, when did wine start coming into this country? And was it unlike rum, beer, and cider in that it was presumably more expensive and a more luxurious drink?
It's very expensive. It has a lot of class overtones, which stay for a long time. But the first time wine is being imported that I know of is in the first generation of the Virginia settlements. They are bringing wine over, and by 1640, I'm seeing wine being served to English visitors, and the governors also having stocks of wine as well. They're not ordering it by the bottle, they're getting it by the pipe, and they're also bringing something that...
How big was a pipe?
I don't know, big though.
A pipe is, a pipe is, there's the old expression about, you drinking your inheritance, because you would buy a pipe for your son, and by the time he turned 18 or 21, because of the port would, after 20 years, would increase in value. And so if you drink your inheritance, obviously you drank all of it. And I believe a pipe is like 280 cases in that neighborhood. It's a lot. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, it's a large amount.
And this was all shipped in barrels, right? Not bottles?
Now, you find in early America, because there has always been a problem until Louis Pasteur and homogenization and pasteurization, all of that shipping bottles of wine over here could be very costly for you because the wine would spoil. Okay, so what did they do? They started making ports and Madeiras, which are fortified wines. They would draw water out.
They don't spoil.
They don't
so well.
spoil, and there's an increased alcohol content. So in a sense, you're getting more bang for your barrel or bang for your buck.
And the legend is that you would send over wine to Africa in the hold so that it would ferment for Madeira.
Exactly, because it was part of the process, the aging process.
Washington loved Madeira, but he also served wine at his table. Madeira, I think if you want to make food taste like the 18th century, add a little Madeira. Seriously.
I love Madeira. Have
I
you
do
all
too. I
tasted
love
Madeira?
Little rainwater, a little.
Yeah, a little rainwater.
A little rainwater.
Go
You have all the different
out
styles.
and taste Madeira tonight. You won't be sorry. I mean, I'm sure you've all had late bottled and late vintage port. It's on
lovely.
a whole other level. It's very rich and very complex because there's so much more caramelization in it.
If you want, seriously, I found that if you want to take chicken, make your chicken soup, leave out any garlic, because they didn't use garlic in the English didn't use garlic in the 18th century very much. Make your chicken soup and add, instead of adding white wine, add Madeira and a teaspoon of ground allspice. And it'll make you will have the flavors of the 18th century there in a pot for yourself.
Well, the 18th century upper class. So
This is true.
at what point does wine and imported wine become affordable? Does it ever before the Second World War? In fact, is it?
You have two different types
Italians
of
brought it
grapes.
over.
There's two different types of grapes. You have Vinifera Lambrusca, and then what was the Native American grape?
Catawba.
And
Yeah.
Catawba.
And we don't even know what that really.
Scuppernong,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
North Carolina.
Yeah.
That was a local indigenous grape that they found didn't make, what's the expression, foxy wines?
Foxy.
Remember,
Foxy
Finger Lakes wines were always foxy wines, and it really wasn't until,
meaning the taste of Concord grapes.
Right.
and it wasn't until the
Don't wince.
1960s.
We're trying to embrace our origins now.
But you know what really intrigues me is that there was a Catawba wine in Ohio that was considered the best wine in America, and we don't know what it tastes. We don't know what it tasted like. It's sort of a sad story.
And the entire Virginia wine industry, which at the beginning Virginia wines were accused of being foxed and
Yes.
foxy, but now they are, taking their place among
They've gotten a lot
America's
better.
regional wines.
They've gotten a
Well,
lot
Jefferson
better.
brought cuttings back, and he actually tried to grow the European grapes, and they didn't take to the
He
environment.
failed.
It just didn't
Too
work.
humid.
And it wasn't until the technology caught up in the 1960s that they're able to do graftings and supplant the Native Americans. So you've got Cabernet clones and Cabernet Franc and other varietals that will grow in upstate New York and Long Island. I think all 50 states, are growing wine now, or grapes for wine, which is interesting when you think about it. Who would have thought New Mexican wines or Alaskan wines? It's because of the technology.
Italians brought wine over and wine growing, and they were growing wine and the Swiss Italians in California early, in the late 19th century.
Oh, I thought it was earlier than that.
Well, that's the Spanish mission goes much. That's
Oh yeah,
300
they
years
had the
before
Spanish
that.
mission, but I mean, Italian immigrants were coming in they come, gold rush, 1849, and then they realize that they're not going to make their money in there, and they are planting vineyards. So there is a less expensive wine source out west with those wines. I'm trying to think, when is wine not
Right,
an
because
elite thing? But I think Italian families
I was about to
were
say,
drinking
at
them.
least in the 1920s, I've just been reading a marvelous book about the history of Italians, especially in New York from about 1919 on. They're middle class and working class. They're all having wine.
Yeah.
It's absolutely part of the family gathering, but I can't think of another ethnic group that's having it as part of the middle working class
Well, I don't
table.
think it was commercialized as much. I mean, you made your, you made your own wine and you consumed. There wasn't a commercial market for, like the Louis Martini wines in the Central Valley. That was a local thing, and it slowly spread. But of course, then Prohibition came along.
Right. So whatever was being built up becomes enormously disruptive with Prohibition. Who wants to tackle why Prohibition even came about in this country?
Well, I can hand it over right to Jim because I could see he was going to jump in there.
Well, when
see if I can find
people
something.
don't realize that 150 years ago, we talk about the inside the Beltway mentality and K Street and lobbying, and the largest lobbying group 150 years ago was temperance. They were the people coming into Washington in the shadow of the White House and trying to influence legislation so that they could prevent the ills of overconsumption of distilled spirits from destroying society. And it was a very, very strong movement. Now it took really, about 60, 70 years for it really to take hold in terms of what happened in the early 1900s. But at the same time that you had temperance on the rise, you also had technology that was allowing pasteurization, allowing you to ferment beer. You've got refrigeration, so you can barrel your beer, send your Budweiser from St. Louis to New York or to Chicago. So there was an increase in the market demand for distilled spirits. So as a gentleman once said, instead of having a pocket flask, you went from the pocket flask to the bottle to the barrel in terms of where the average consumption, say, in Rhode Island in 1800 was maybe 2 quarts of distilled spirit a year, within 50 years, it was up to about 10 gallons a year.
In 1900?
I'm talking 1800.
Okay, because it reached, alcohol consumption reached its peak around 1830, 1840.
Oh, yeah.
So that's when the temperance movement really takes off, along with abolitionism and women's suffrage movement. All of these reform movements are going on in the 19th century, right? They're getting...
Well, you know who led the way? I mean, Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. in like 1930, somebody did a demographic, and we were 30 times the national average in alcohol consumption. Who knew, you know? The wheels... This is in the 1930s. This is after the repeal of Prohibition.
I thought the Volstead Act was repealed in 33.
That's what I'm saying. And somebody did a study, and I guess you could say, greasing or lubricating the wheels of democracy. I mean, Washingtonians have always had a taste.
I'm going to take you back a little bit here. In the first time he ran for an elected office, which was in the House of Burgesses, George Washington provided 75 gallons of whiskey to his voters to encourage. And you really, of course there was no problem with voter turnout back then. I mean, it's just amazing. But even though that was a lot, it was normal to be serving alcohol.
And was it domestic whiskey?
It was his, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that after he established the 2-term precedent and went back to Mount Vernon, his farm manager took him aside and said,
I love this.
General.
Scottish farm manager.
Yes, Scottish farm manager. I can tell you how to make a little more money on that rye crop than what you're getting right now.
After all, he's Scottish.
That's right.
He was an Anderson, right?
Yes, exactly, Mr. Anderson. And he taught Washington, he set up a distillery, and Washington would become one of the largest liquor distillers and distributors, whiskey, in America. And he actually made a big profit on it. It was one of his most profitable endeavors. And if you go to Mount Vernon today, you'll see that they have rebuilt the whiskey distillery, and you can buy the type of whiskey that would have been made from what he provided. He didn't do the aging there. He sold clear alcohol in barrels and distributed it to other people who kind of put their own brand on it and made it whiskey. But as this more and more people, so rum was popular in the colonial period. Inland, you get the rise of bourbon and darker alcohols. In the 19th century, for spirits, the darker alcohol, am I saying this right? Darker liquors like whiskey were more bourbon. I mean, think about what a sort of stereotypical image you have of the Southern gentleman during the antebellum period, sitting on the porch smoking his cheroot and having a mint julep.
Yeah.
Nobody
Belvedere,
makes more mint juleps than this man, right? The world's most productive mint julep maker.
I think we have to have a little break to hear how you make mint juleps, because I'm now in Atlanta, which a lot of the time, which considers itself, julep land. It's near enough Kentucky. So you're here in Washington, and tell us where you came up with your julep muddling strategy. Everyone has to know how to muddle in Atlanta. So how do you do it?
Well, it's as I tell people, it's not rocket science. It's very
yes, it is.
It's not rocket science. Now, you go all through the South, whether you're in Georgia, you're in Savannah, everybody has a recipe for a julep. Now, a julep basically is any kind of sweetened water. It's an Arabic term, as is like Siddiqui and Peg and what have you. And a julep is sweetened water. Now, why would you sweeten your water? Well, adding apple juice. You couldn't drink the water if you were living in the wrong place. If you drank the water, you got sick, unless you added something to it. And the julep evolved because what you would do is you would take mint leaves, with sugar, and a little bit of any kind of distilled spirit, and you'd muddle that, and it would bring out those flavors, Now, the mint julep, as we know it from Kentucky, evolved where you would take Kentucky straight sour mash whiskey, corn whiskey, okay, that's aged. There's a specific way that corn whiskey needs to be made. Anybody who, an interesting story, when we opened up the Willard Hotel 29 years ago, the powers that be decided we need to do the thing with the mint julep because Henry Clay brought the first Southern-style mint julep to Washingtonians who were using brandies or cognacs or rum to make their juleps.
Can you imagine?
It's sacrilege, right?
What were they thinking?
So we're told that we're going to be making our mint juleps using Jack Daniels. Now, Jack Daniels is Tennessee walking whiskey. And I said to some powers that be, I said, I think we need to look at this recipe and perhaps use a Kentucky straight sour mash whiskey that's made in Bourbon County that originally was brought to Washingtonians back in the early 1800s by Senator Henry Clay. He'd bring his barrels with him because glass was very expensive, didn't travel well, but that barrel that had bourbon burned in the side of it, and everybody's going, you know, they used to call it, you know, Kentucky Red or Red Dog, or, you know, because of its red color. And as I say, it's a, you know, I say the mint julep is the most elegant of cocktails and a fitting showcase for a uniquely American invention, bourbon. Nobody else makes bourbon like they do in Bourbon County. And I'll tell you, the guys in Bourbon County will be the first to tell you that too, won't they? You know.
I was recently in Louisville, and the mayor, who's a very forward-thinking politician who's trying to do enormous amounts of support sustainable agriculture, introduce it into the school system. I mean, there's a lot going on right now in Louisville. And he said that it is essentially due to one thing, and it's the bourbon tourism industry, because that's what's bringing people there.
The Bourbon Trail.
And there is indeed a bourbon trail. But tell us more about Prohibition, why you brought this picture, and you were saying a very entertaining anecdote about a woman who I think is in the exhibition as well as a woman you might have written about.
Oh, well, this is an image of Carrie Nation.
Oh, this is Carrie Nation.
Not Daisy Simpson.
I've been thinking about Carrie Nation.
All right, Carrie Nation. And I have to tell you, when I first saw this picture, I thought she was standing on board a steamship.
It does look that way,
Doesn't it look that way? It's a brewery.
Wow.
And if you go see the exhibit and you see that big old still that belonged to George Washington, you get it. It's like a smaller version of what you're seeing there, but you'll see pictures that look like that. To answer one way of explaining why did America end up with prohibition, no other country has been so foolish as to do this. And in fact, I was coming over here in my little Uber, and the guy was an Egyptian teacher. He taught Egypt, the driver, taught Egyptian to the State Department, was making some extra money driving. And he said, you know, I told him where I was, well, he asked me where I was going to the National Archives at night, so I sort of spilled the beans. And he said, you know, I live in a Muslim country, and even we do not ban alcohol. Why did you do that? And I thought, gee. And I said, well, you know, we have this really funny dynamic that goes on in America, and that we have this very, very idealistic strain that we believe that we can make a law to make people perfect. And it has never worked, but we keep trying over and over again. And I think that it's important to remember that the first temperance movements, they were clubs, and some of them were even men's clubs in New York. There was a men's temperance club, and you could only drink wine with dinner. So it was not about, you know, don't drink rum, don't drink whiskey, just drink wine. Obviously, this was an elite group of guys. They probably were getting potted on really good wine, but the first temperance movements were not about banning all alcohol. It was reducing the amount of alcohol that people were drinking. And you're talking about a time in America when people really drank a lot more, double what we drink today. So that's a lot. But what interests me is that they were able to get an amendment passed, and that's a lot of political will. It seems to come out, some of it is out of the impulses of progressivism, which is really trying to reform America in many ways, and it comes out of World War I.
It's 1919.
Yeah, after World War I. Well, at the last day.
And there's also, isn't it related to the history of suffragettes and suffragists and just the whole suffrage movement?
Try something new.
And Carrie Nation, again, the influence of women.
Yeah.
But tell us about the other woman.
Oh, Daisy Simpson. She's a good story, and I have to tell you, I didn't know this story until Monday. I'm only being honest because I admitted that to.
Because it's right here at the exhibition,
is.
so you can all
You can all learn
from
it. Anyway, this is so great. One of the things on the exhibition, they have IDs of the Treasury Department investigators. What are they called? You know, like the
Special
the
agents.
agents, right? The special agents, and they had women. Because women were really good at getting into, they'd be welcome into the saloon, right? They didn't say, oh no, look out, who is it? Who is it? They'd see some charming young woman, hello, and they'd open the door. Well, there was one, and her ID is there, looking really great, photograph, colorized. And apparently, I was told this by one of the wonderful curators last night, or Monday night, Daisy Simpson was famous for having fainted outside of what they thought was a speakeasy. And sure enough, the men came out and they rescued her and they brought her back in. She was absolutely collapsed. And they gave her some whiskey to revive her. So she pulls her badge out of her bosom and arrests them all. It's so great. It's one of the best stories.
But then...
Don't you love that? Come on. That's a great story. You've got to see the exhibit.
But then what happens to the undercover women agents?
Well, then they're too good, and they're never hired again. They end their career, even during Prohibition. They didn't last through Prohibition,
So
I think. But even if it was, or just around the end of it.
So
Very
Prohibition was repealed, but women got the vote. So both things ended happily.
They did.
Um,
But women got the vote just a year after Prohibition began. So women didn't vote against Prohibition. They voted for. They didn't have the vote when it came in.
but they were largely, weren't they, on the
1920.
Crusaders?
They were the Crusaders, but
Yeah.
they weren't voting. They weren't voting on federal elections. The amendment was passed in 1919.
Before women had the vote.
Yeah.
But I think of women as being so instrumental
They were.
in its
They were.
passage.
Well, then you have to also, culturally, when you think about, there was a time when temperance started because, if the taverns are open on Sunday, people aren't going to go to church. They're going to go to the tavern, okay? So it's kind of, as an extension, you think in terms of Industrial Revolution, liquor, people the consumption's up, productivity seems like if we could stop people from drinking their
Right.
wages away and not being productive members of society, by taking the alcohol out, it's going to help everybody.
Well, they
And this
had the
is-
blue
Blue,
laws
I just was going to say blue laws.
that kept
Go right
them,
ahead.
kept them closed on Sundays.
And then that
that's why
just-
you have Sundays.
and
And
it
now it's
kept
about
growing.
drinking in church.
Yeah. Was
And
it? I didn't
drinking
know
in church.
that. No
and-
drinking in church?
No, drinking and church.
Oh.
To
And
keep
church.
people at church and out of taverns. And,
You go to a church where you don't drink.
theoretically,
I'm just kidding.
theoretically with
Sorry.
their families.
Only sacramental wines, right?
Right, sorry. That was silly.
So in the idea of happy endings, why don't we go to Q&A? And if you've got any questions, I've got some others queued up. But if you've got some, we're going to ask you to go to one of the microphones on the side. Not because we can't hear you, we can, but because this is being recorded. So first up at the mic is going to be this gentleman.
This gentleman, me.
That's you.
Okay. Libby, I want to thank you for a wonderful book. I've had read through it, very entertaining, very
Which you will all be
informative.
buying this evening.
Okay. I already bought it. I have a question. It covers a lot of things. It's really a wonderful history, and it goes from beaver tail up to granola. And the question I have for all of you, what I found interesting, it tells you a lot about what we eat, how we eat it, et cetera. So, we have the TV dinner. We have all sorts of fun stuff in there. And I kind of have the question, I do have the question, what are we going to be eating and drinking in 25, 30 years? How are we going to eat? We go to restaurants a lot. What's the nutrition content? What's the technology? What's going to change? What are our children going to be eating, and how are they going to be eating and drinking?
Well, we're already on the progressive movement of from farm to table in terms of how we eat. With fast food restaurants and genetic engineering of foods and what have you, I think we're going to be eating healthier. That's an interesting question when you think about where, what's going to be the McDonald's in 30 years, or
Is there going to be a McDonald's in 30
is there going to be a
years?
McDonald's, or are we going to be eating?
All engineered food. Libby?
I am hoping that we're able to have healthier alternatives that are convenient. For example, oysters, raw oysters. They were America's first fast food. They're very healthy. And somehow our associations with fast food has become unhealthy, right? Our fast food is unhealthy. Why can't, it seems to be within our grasp and something that people are talking about, is to make food that's easily accessible be very healthy for you.
And when we're talking accessible, we definitely mean affordable.
Affordable.
Because that's the most important thing, where we've come to the pass at which, in order to eat like our forebears, much less processed food, it costs twice as much.
Costs twice as much. So that would be something I hope. I don't know what is realistic to think, although I bet you might. I think, sadly, we are not going to have as much wild fish. We've all grown up eating wild fish. I think our oceans have been so depleted that the days of having wild fish has just been versus farm fish, that wild fish will become very expensive.
It is
more than
already.
they are already.
Yeah, it will definitely become so.
Yeah.
Madam?
This is such a political town, as well as becoming now, in the last over decades, a foodie town. I have two words for you that I think are pertinent to the discussion. Whiskey rebellion. Yeah, that was really the beginning of a kind of a politics where they were. At any rate, you know the history, but could you comment on that and how it integrates into the?
It's interesting when you think in terms of that. We threw off our English cousins because of taxation, whether it was sugar or tea or consumer goods. We didn't want to pay someone else.
Right.
So we're forming a government, and you have people who are saying, well, with states, poli-sci 101. The bottom line is you've got to raise revenue. Hamilton said it, a government that takes in less money than it spends has a deficit problem, and where are we right now, right? Where's Alexander Hamilton when you needed him? Well, that was Gallatin, I think, initially said that. George Washington is a distiller, and he liked to always set an example. So he's saying, well, I'm distilling spirits. I'm going to pay taxes. I'm not going to allow somebody out in western Pennsylvania or in Kentucky to make whiskey and not pay taxes like I do. And that's what caused the whiskey rebellion. He was taxing to raise revenue, and you had a group of people who said, you know what? We're out here, the heck with the federal government, we're not paying our taxes. And what did he do? He sent the troops in. And that kind of set the basis for taxing distilled spirits. Now, it's a fascinating thing, when the British defeated us in 1777, and Washington had to leave New York, and he goes into New Jersey. The Laird family, who make Applejack, again getting back to apples, Applejack is a whiskey distillate. Well, in 1777, this is a year before Valley Forge, what got his army through that winter was Applejack. Well, when he became president and they're taxing distilleries, who got the first license? The Laird family has the #1 license, and which is interesting when you think about it. What things going around and coming around.
Help win battles. Gentlemen.
Hi, good evening. I have a question about punch. Specifically to James, if I wanted to try a good punch in DC, is there a bar that you would recommend?
I think you're playing into his hands, no?
Now,
and more largely, is there going to be a resurgence in punch since you guys talked
There
about
is.
the
There is
resurgence in
already.
draft cider?
very definitely. And the thing about punch that people think about punch, you get the big ball. Well, punch was a center of a social gathering. Everybody shared in the punch. It was served in the afternoon. It was a very social thing. The punches that I make are basically a breakdown of those whether it's a Roman punch or every island in the Caribbean has a rum punch, depending upon what island you're on. The different flavorings that go into the punches. So the punches that I make, like at the Round Robin Bar at the Willard Intercontinental Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. Anyway, what I try to do is recreate the flavors that, say, 200 years ago, if you were, or not even that, let's say it's Grant's inaugural, and they're serving a Roman punch, which has a rum and brandy base with pineapple. Which
Why
is
called Roman?
Good question. Good question. Why Roman punch?
I
You
wonder
got
if
me
it's
on
Roman senators as opposed to anything that grows in Rome. I mean, there aren't oranges in it or something that's near Rome or
A lot of
Sicily.
times there are citrus fruits.
Or-
In this case, it was
Or
pineapple.
why fish house punch,
Right.
right? Well, it was served in the fish houses. But Roman, that's interesting. Why Roman?
So what else went into it besides pineapple, or was that the main
It's
flavor?
citrus, lots of sugar. There'd be a natural fermentation that would take place. But it's basically, and that's what they served at Grant's first inaugural. In fact, it was so cold, the punch bowls actually froze. And all of the turtle doves that they brought into the, for the inaugural, it was so cold they
died.
They were like falling on people, hurting them.
Kind of like Boston's winter, which you're all lucky to have missed.
I have a punch story that many of you may be familiar with, but it's also related to inaugural partying. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated, he has this famous incident where he has an open house at the White House, and literally everybody came from all walks of life, and the house was too crowded, and they were serving punch. They were serving a whiskey brandy orange mixture. It was an orange punch with some sugar in it. And people were going into the kitchen to get more, and they were very drunk. Fist fights broke out, and some wise member of his staff said, "Take the booze outside." And so they took all the punch bowls filled with punch out to be outside the house, and people went through the windows to get to the punch bowls. And then they closed the doors. That's a true story, actually.
But think of a frat house. It's still a strategy that works.
And why should I be surprised, right? I should have remembered that from
Right.
college.
And one of the most famous punches that evolved into a very common is the Long Island iced tea.
Yeah.
You're it's Prohibition, and you're at a garden party on Long Island. Everybody brings a bottle, and you pour it into a bowl, and you put a little bit of Coca-Cola or whatever, and a little bit of lemon juice, and you know what? It tastes the same.
But it's true. But the one thing I think that's interesting about mixed drinks during Prohibition is how that's when you see the rise of clear drinks. Gin had always been very popular in Britain among the working class. Famous line Fagin says to Oliver, "Shut up and drink your gin," which is one of my favorite Dickens moments. But we're talking about America, so the clear alcohol.
Eliza Doolittle,
Yeah.
gin was like mother's milk
That's
to her
right.
mother.
That's right. Clear alcohol has a upsurge during Prohibition because supposedly you could tell if it had been tainted, which isn't true at all. I mean, there was plenty of poison that was created in bathtub gins, but they felt that if you could see through your alcohol, it would be healthier for you than who knows what they put into the dark whiskey. Right?
But it's also the time of the rise of the cocktail, is it not?
Well, no. Well, I think there's a
The 1920s?
there's a big boom in the sort of mixed drinks because the booze tastes so bad. That's what I always heard.
As they would say, you need something to cover the hog tracks or to,
Yeah.
it's true. It's, our technology is such that flavors can be recreated, with different engineering, what have you. But, you go back 200 years ago, you had to make your own ingredients.
Yeah.
You made your own bitters. What were the bitters in there for? Well, to kill some of those flavors and things that would upset your stomach or whatever in the drink. Now, in terms of the concept of the cocktail, really goes back 200 years in terms of people making a cocktail, which originally would be consumed early in the morning for medicinal reasons. Like they say, the quick pick-me-upper, the eye-opener.
Right.
The cocktail traditionally was a short drink, usually made with brandy and a little bit of bitters. In a little, and now if you talk to somebody from New Orleans, they'll say it was made in a cocktail, which is like an egg, a little egg glass. Whereas your punches and other drinks, punches were made with citrus, and they were tall drinks, and you drank them in the afternoon, you drank them later on. So you had this concept of, you know, what do I drink for breakfast? What do I drink for lunch? What do I drink for dinner? You know,
we have the,
you know,
But remember, they didn't have Advil. I mean, and it's important to think about how, I mean, I don't know if any of you shoveled snow this winter, but I mean, 20 minutes of shoveling snow and I need Advil big time. Seriously, I mean, it hurts.
Sorry, I live in Boston.
So
I
you
did
know what I'm
nothing
talking
but-
about,
I did
right?
nothing but shovel snow
Right,
this winter.
so they didn't have that. You would come back and the doctor would, if you did not want to drink whiskey, your doctor might prescribe it for you anyway.
well, there's a story about a gentleman who
It's true.
had come to Washington in the summertime. Now, summertime here can get very, very hot.
Right.
And, you know, there was some bottomland here, and it gets hot and muggy. And, you know, you could suffer from the vapors, as they would say, or it might be swamp gas, whatever, but people would get sick. And the gentleman, his doctor prescribed him some powders to make in his mint julep, take it every morning when he woke up in his mint julep, and not to be afraid of having one every 2 hours. No, see, so, and the gentleman says to him, he goes, well, wait a minute, I'm not much of a drinker. I mean, I'll have a little nip in the morning.
Right.
You want me to do one of these every, he goes, and he's like, that's like 6 drinks a day. And he goes, oh, you'll be just fine, because the julep's not going to kill you, and the powder's good for you. And sure enough, he didn't get sick all summer.
Well, there's actually a doctor's prescription for whiskey in the exhibit. There's a prescription, handwritten prescription in the exhibition here. Somebody prescribing a shot of whiskey, and you'll see it
Well,
here.
I think our prescription for the evening is to buy Libby's book and to see the exhibition.
I just met him.
And and I thank you all for coming here.
You guys have been great.
Thanks very much.